Adobe After Effects is one of the best softwares to learn if you plan on making video content of any kind. Today, I'm going to teach you everything I know about After Effects. I have over 400 tutorials on After Effects alone, so my goal is that this video serves as a reference for beginners looking to start, as well as for intermediate or advanced users looking to pick up extra tips. Now, one huge disclaimer here before we start. My background is in music video and content editing. If you're looking for a more motion design focused look at After Effects, I highly recommend you check out Ben Marriott or Sonduk Film. Both of them create great content. My style is more focused towards filmmakers, music video editors, short form influencers, and everything in between. My goal is to teach you how to use After Effects to control the different elements of a video. I believe After Effects is a tool, and like all tools, there's no right or wrong way to use them. I'll have timestamps and chapters down below so you can watch at your own pace. If you'd like to support me and the production of these videos, I have a Patreon down below with project files and other assets, as well as an online store with curated digital presets and plugin packs for a variety of different editing softwares. Links to those down below. So with that said, let's get started. All right, guys, so here we are within After Effects. And of course, to actually work within this, we need some footage, some pictures that we can drag in to use as our assets. So if you are new, I recommend you use a stock footage website just to practice if you don't have any footage from a client that you can work with. I recommend pexels.com. I went ahead and created a new folder here. I recommend you do this for all your projects. Place all of your assets in this folder. Little trick here, if you're in Windows, you can just click that little button in the top right to show where it saves, and then you can just drag this directly into After Effects. You'll see the project panel lit up, just drag it straight into here. So once you have your footage within After Effects, you need to create a composition, and this is sort of the workspace for this footage. You can either click this create a new composition button that's in the project bin, you can click here, or you can just drag this over here. If I drag and create a new composition, it's going to create this composition based on the resolution of this footage. And you can see the resolution for your footage. If you go to project bin, it's going to be right there at 4096 by 2160. If I go to composition, comp settings, you see it's automatically matching that. So say, for example, you have 4K footage, but you only want to make a 1920 by 1080 video. You could go to create composition, 1920 by 1080, you can name it, you can set your frame rate, you have all the control right there. So I'll rename this to tutorial, we'll drag in our footage here, and you see because this is 4K footage within our 1920 by 1080 comp, we need to right click on it, go to transform, and you want to click fit to comp. So that's your basics of actually getting started, getting your footage into After Effects. Let's talk about the UI for a little bit here. We talked about the project bin on the left. That's where we're going to start. That's where all of our footage is housed. We also have our timeline down here, and you can switch between different compositions. So this is the composition I created. This is the one that I dragged in from the footage. Over on the right here, you're going to see effects presets, and it may look different for you. If you ever need to find a specific window, you can just go up to the window tab up here, and you can just check on whatever you need. This is what it should look like by default. Now, another big part of the UI here is the effect controls. So if you go to your effects and presets and say we search for something like, we'll go with a tint effect. This is just going to change everything to black and white. Anytime you apply an effect, you need to go up to this tab over here in the top right, the effect controls, to actually be able to change around that effect. If you put that there by default, it's automatically going to put you there. You may be wondering, where's my footage? You have to go back to the project bin. So here's your two tabs, project and your effect controls. So now let's talk about some of our tools up here in the top left. You have your normal selection tool, hand and zoom. I rarely ever use these. I would just ignore these. I rarely ever use rotation, anchor point tool. This one's important, but we'll talk about that later. You have your masking tools, text tools, your clone stamp, brushes, Rotobrushes, and puppet tool. So all these are very useful for controlling your layers. Number one, I would say, would be masking. You can grab your pen tool, and if we just click around here, you can draw any custom mask that you want. Just make sure you connect at the end to actually set it how you'd like it. You can do the same with your other tools. So if you want to see that mask, you click M on your keyboard to show the mask options. We'll delete that. You can also alt click on this or just click and hold down to show the different shape tools. So for example, maybe you just want a circle, draw like this. Again, if we're clicking M to show that mask, you're immediately going to have this drop down where you can set it to add, subtract. Those are the only two you really need to know as a beginner. This is, we want the mask within that. This is, we want to cut away what's within the mask. You also have your text tool, pretty self-explanatory. draw in the box here. Once you do that, you want to go over to this character panel on the right. That'll allow you to change your font. You can load in your own custom fonts. You can change the formatting, and you can just type in whatever. Now, a big shortcut here, anytime you want to custom move anything just by dragging around, you'll see if I'm trying to drag this, it's not working because I'm still selecting the text tool in the top left. You can just click away and then click V on your keyboard. And that's the shortcut to select the normal selection tool, which is useful just for being able to actually drag things around visually. Now, it's very important here to know the basics of layer stacking and how that works within After Effects. If you're familiar with Photoshop, it's the same idea as Photoshop. And the way I like to say it is that you have to think of it like a sandwich. Down here, you're going to see your different layers. Whatever layer is on top is going to be showing on top. So for example, if I take this tutorial layer and I place it beneath my footage, you're not even going to see it because it's in a layer beneath the footage. So if I was to take my footage, drag it over, you see, there's that tutorial layer. So keep that in mind. Again, always think of it like a sandwich. The layer structure is very important. Now, finishing up our tools up here, again, we have our masking. We also have the brush tool, which is kind of specific. I'm not going to talk about this in this tutorial. The ones that I use the most are the Rotobrush tool because it's essentially an automated way of masking so that you can actually mask moving footage without having to go frame by frame trying to track it all. See, if we delete the text, if I was to try and say, I want only this guy, not the background, if I click play, this is a static mask and this is moving footage. So this mask isn't changing even though the footage is changing. So a good way to work around that is the Rotobrush tool. And I'm not going to overload you right now. We're going to keep it very simple. So we'll talk about the Rotobrush tool at the end, but do keep in mind, it is one of the most important tools in my opinion for After Effects because it allows you to mask moving footage. Now, it's a good idea as a beginner to not overload yourself with complex things. And a great way to do that, especially if you're coming from a Photoshop background, is to just work with pictures and use After Effects to animate your pictures. You can even turn your video footage into a picture. So we can right click on any shot we want. We can go up to time and you can click on freeze frame. This is going to freeze this specific shot where your playhead is at this specific moment and turn it into a picture. So now you'll see if I drag along the timeline, it's just a still image. There's no movement. And again, this is great just for practicing, figuring a few things out without them messing up early. For this, you could use something like the Puppet tool. This is the last tool we'll talk about for now. The Puppet tool is great. I've talked about this a bunch in creating animated visualizers. You can essentially just click the spots that you want to animate. And then once you select Puppet, you can grab these, drag them, move however. This is great for creating little swaying animations of still images. And again, if you're a beginner, I highly recommend you can just take some images, use the Puppet tool, create a little animation, which we'll show you in a tiny bit. You're immediately able to produce some works with After Effects. So there's your Puppet tool. We'll swing back to that when we show you how to animate. Let's start talking about the layers themselves and how you can actually understand these layers and control them. The easiest way to think about this when you're a beginner is just pay attention to these little droppable arrows right here. So anytime you want to figure something out for a layer, you click this arrow and you're going to have a few more arrows. So you have an arrow for transform, you have an arrow for effects and masks if you have those applied. And again, if you don't know any shortcuts, if you don't know any ways to quickly navigate, just stick to the arrows. It's a lot easier. So the first one you should know is transform. This has all of the transform data. You're going to see your position. And if I move this, you're going to see we now move left and right. You're going to see your scale, so we can move up and down. You're going to see your rotation. And you're going to see your opacity. The anchor point may be confusing because you may think it's the same as the position. Essentially, the only thing you really need to know about anchor point, it's the center of where your layer is transforming. You can actually see that right here. You see this little target dot, that is your anchor point. And you can actually control where this is at by grabbing this tool in the top left. You'll see it says pan behind or anchor point tool. If you select that here, now it'll allow you to actually grab this target and move it wherever you want. So if I move it up in the top right and then scale, you're going to see it's scaling from that anchor point. So if you want something to scale from the center, you need to make sure the anchor point is in the center, and now it'll scale from that point. Now, if you are someone who likes shortcuts, I'm going to go over some of them. I already talked about the M key on your keyboard to bring up the mask options. So that's a nice nifty little one. You can also click S for scale, pretty self-explanatory. You can click P for position. You could click T for opacity. And yeah, those are the main ones I really go to: P position, S scale, T opacity, M mask. Another big one is duplicating. So a lot of the times, and especially with a lot of effects that I show in my videos, you have to duplicate your layer. To duplicate, you want to click Control D on your keyboard. So keep that in mind, Control D. Now, if I move over this layer, we have 2 layers. So very useful. Make sure you know how to duplicate. Another big one is to split the layers. So instead of trying to drag the duration, maybe I want this frame this long, something like that. Instead of working with duration here, you want to split. So you want to click Control Shift D on your keyboard, and that's going to split the layer. Again, splitting is different from changing this duration here. It's a lot easier just to split. It's a lot more easy to understand. So that's essentially your cut, Control Shift D. So if I want this out here, I click Control Shift D. Now I can delete this part and we have a hard cut right there. So now let's show you how to animate. And before we do that, a little brush up on what we've learned here. Again, just paying attention to the arrows. If you ever need to change anything with the mask, again, just follow the arrows. You have your mask path, you have your feather, and these are essentially just controls for how you want the mask to look. Same with effects. You can control these straight from here, or in the effect controls, you have either option. And then the transform. And this is where we're going to actually create some motion. So you're going to see these little stopwatches, and you'll see here it says it toggles the ability of the property to change over time. So this is called setting a keyframe. So let's simplify our workspace here. I'm going to click Control D to duplicate this one more time. And what we're going to do is create a simple keyframe animation where the layer that's beneath this top layer sort of swivels out. So we'll open up Transform, and we're going to find Position. So a big key here to setting up your keyframes properly is paying attention to the timing. So this is what controls your timing, your current time indicator. So if you want your animation to go from the 0 second mark to the 4 second mark, you need to start at 0 and you need to lock in the keyframe for what you're trying to change. In our case, we want to just move it to the left. So keyframe position, and you're going to see it's going to set this keyframe. So it's locking in this position data at this point. Now we can drag to 4 seconds and we're going to make a change to this. So let's just look at our footage. We'll keep dragging to the left, see how long we like it. We'll let go right there, and you'll see it sets another keyframe. So whenever you create a keyframe, it's going to change from this value. And if I click play, now in 4 seconds, it's going to go to that value. So that's the key to making the keyframes. You find the timing that you want, and you can control this, of course. If you think this is too slow, okay, we'll just grab the keyframe. Let's make it 2 seconds. So now, there we go. We can drag in the keyframe. Now it's 1 second. So you're just controlling the timing of these different data values. You can drag it out if you want it to be super slow like this. But yeah, that's the absolute basics of setting our keyframes. And you can do that with everything. You can do that with scale, rotation, opacity, whatever. As long as you set that keyframe and make some changes, it's going to go crazy and get to that point. So we're going to talk a little bit more in depth about the animation system, keyframes, making these look a lot better. But before we do that, let's just quickly talk about this little panel right here that goes from left to right. The two main things being this drop down. This is the resolution downscale. This is super important because if you're lagging, After Effects uses a lot of memory. It's a good idea to change the resolution. You see I have it at half right now. If everything's still being very slow, you can put that down to quarter, and it's just going to lower the playback resolution to fourth. So keep that in mind. The other one right here, this is just showing the active mask. So for example, if you're doing something, you don't like seeing this purple line of the mask every time you're trying to work something out, you can just toggle the mask on and off, and that's just showing or hiding the lines. It's not actually removing the mask, but it's useful to know. Also, another big thing to know here, to be able to control the timing for your composition. You see right now, this is 30 seconds. Maybe you don't want to upload, maybe you don't want to export out 30 seconds of this shot. You can just grab this bar here and drag it for however long you need. So we'll set it to 4 seconds. Once you do that, you can right click on the bar and we can go over to trim comp to work area. And once we do that, Easy as that. We now have a 4-second composition. So if you're doing some sort of 3D track or anything that's processing your footage like rotoscoping, it's a great idea to trim the comp before you do that so that you're not tracking and analyzing every single second of the footage. You're only analyzing the part that you need. You can also go up to composition comp settings, and right here you're going to see the start code and the duration, so you can custom set the duration if you need to right from there. Now, if we go a bit more in depth into animation, first of all, it's good to know that you have this toggle switches and modes button. This is going to show some extra values, and this may be confusing. If you're following tutorials, you'll be like, I don't see that. Always just click toggle switches and modes. These are your switches. These are your modes. So modes stand for your blending modes. So we can click the drop down, and this is exactly like Photoshop. You can change to any of these different blending modes to sort of blend these layers together. And each of that has a different use. We'll talk about that in a bit. You have your track mats, which we'll also talk about near the end. I don't want to overcomplicate things right now. Let's go over to the switches. And you're going to see right here, you have frame blending, you have motion blur, adjustment layer, and 3D layer. So the ones that I use the most are motion blur and 3D layer. So for the motion blur switch, this one is great for animation because if we look at the animation here, it's just kind of stiff and unrealistic. If you want to create realistic motion, which is a huge part in After Effects and video editing and music video effects, if that's what you're using it for, I highly recommend you use this motion blur switch. So all you have to do is toggle it on. So we'll toggle on the motion blur switch for both of these. By default, once you toggle it on, it'll enable it for the composition as a whole. Now, once you do that, you're going to have some motion blur. And the motion blur is dependent on the speed of the clip. So you see right now, there's not a lot of motion blur, but if we take this keyframe and we make it a lot faster, so it's going to be a very quick, sudden movement, now you're going to see a little bit of motion blur. And it's kind of subtle to see. So if you need to, if I zoom in here and I toggle the motion blur switch on and off, you're going to see the difference. You can also go up to composition settings. And under the advanced tab here, you can also control the motion blur. So if you need more, you can just crank that up. And you see now we have a ton of motion blur. So motion blur is great for creating a lot more realistic looking motion. If you want to go even more advanced into this, you could use some keyframe graph editor type things. So on the base level, you can zoom in with Control, Alt, and mouse wheel, or just use this little slider right here to zoom in. You can right click on any of these keyframes and you're going to have this keyframe assistant. You have some default easy ease in. So these are just some presets for smoothing out the keyframe. You'll see now it's not as linear, it's not as stiff, kind of swivels out in a nicer fashion. So you can do that for an easy little adjustment of the keyframes, or even better, you can click over to the graph editor and you can see that right here. And that'll actually show you, if we select the keyframe, make sure you're selecting the layer to actually see this, a graph of what this motion is doing. And this is fully customizable. So you can grab any of these to smooth out or change your keyframes custom. So if I create this like big ramp, now it's going to be slow and then quick ramp. So you have full control over the keyframes with the graph editor. Again, if I do something like this, it's going to be slow, quick ramp, back to slow, like that. So there is the basics of our keyframe animation, and you're going to need that solid foundation for everything that we're adding motion to, whether that be a layer using transform like this or an effect. All right, so let's get out of our graph editor and we're going to talk about pre-composing, something that I was extremely confused about early on. It is very important when it comes to After Effects, and once you understand it, it is pretty simple. Let's think about the word pre-composing. We already know that composing or creating our composition is the first thing that we do. Click here, create a composition, gives us our blank slate, and we can work within that. Well, pre-composing is the exact same thing, except it's creating a composition within a composition. So instead of creating a new composition and dragging it in, you can just right click any of these layers. So let's select both of them, right click, and we can click on pre-compose. So this is going to put them in their new composition, and I'll name this layer swivel out right here. So instead of having two layers, we just have this single composition. If we go to effect controls, none of what we did in here is in this effect controls. So you can stack more effects on top using this method. You can control both of these layers from this pre-comp easily. And anytime you need to go back and make any adjustments to what's happening within this pre-comp all you have to do is just double click. You'll see now we're in layer swivel out. Now, if we go to the effect controls of these layers, we can control everything there. So it's a great way to keep everything organized and to be able to stack different layers. So for example, instead of having 50 layers for our main subject matter, now we can just pre-comp them into one. We could create another composition for our background. So I'm going to right click new solid, and this is just creating a blank color as a layer. We'll drag this layer beneath here, and this is going to be our background. So we could right click, pre-compose this one, and I'll name this background. So it's a good way to keep things organized. Again, we can go into the background layer. You can make any changes here. You can use your masking tools, and I'm not going to go in depth for this, but if you're not selecting a layer, you can create a shape layer. So if I draw like this, now I'm just drawing a specific shape. So that's the difference between shape layers and masking. If we select the layer and do the same thing, it's going to create a mask. But if we're not selecting the layer and we're just drawing, it's going to create a shape layer for whatever it is we just drew. So I just created a circle. Now if I click V, I have this shape layer of a circle. And again, this is in the pre-comp. So if I go back into my original, again, keep in mind your layers. This is layer swivel out. This is background. This is our main layer tutorial, and everything is nice and tidy. So now let's take what we've learned and apply some effects to actually create some sort of video edit. I'm going to show you some of the most common effects used in After Effects. We'll just start messing around with this composition. We'll create something cool, and you can see in a sense how we can build this workflow where we're creating our composition. We're using these tools to control the layers. We're applying the effects. We're animating them and building what it is that we want to build. All right, so now I'm going to brush over some of the most commonly used effects, and obviously the software is called After Effects. There's a ton of different effects you can find here in your effects and presets. There's also tons of third-party plugins and presets or whatever that you can add into here. So I'm not going to go through and explain every little thing. You'll probably discover a lot of those as you go along and watch specific tutorials. So blur and sharpen is a big one. Blurs are very important for controlling motion, for blurring out specific things, for isolating a specific subject, whether that's blurring out the background, blurring out a specific part, whatever. You have your camera lens blurs, your radial blurs, your fast blurs, directional blurs, Gaussian blurs. Color correction, you have everything in here from controlling your brightness and your contrast, which is very simple. You can just drag that on there. You know, it's just a simple slider. You also have curves, which is very useful, and I use that one a lot. This just gives you a simple line for controlling the lights or the darks. Again, pretty self-explanatory. You also have exposure in there. You have your tint effect, which I showed you a bit earlier. This just makes everything two specific colors. So if you want, you can make this red. And now again, everything's two colors. Very nice and easy. So there's your color correction. Distortion, you have tons of different ways to distort. The most common ones, CC lens is really cool. It just puts everything in this lens effect, this fisheye distortion, and you can control this and keyframe this to make different animations. The most common one is probably turbulent displace. If you're looking for crazy distortion, turbulent displace has all these different presets and a ton of different parameters for controlling the distortion. You also have magnify, liquefy, which you have in Photoshop, which is essentially just a brush. So I can raise the pressure, raise the brush size. You have your pinching tool, bulging. So if I just click here, it's just going to sort of like liquefy bulge. You see that in a lot of music videos, the big bulging eyes. Again, you can animate everything within there. You have your generate, which I think is slept on a lot because it allows you to create different light and different looks from scratch. So say, for example, I want to add some nice color to this. What you do is just create a placeholder layer. And you can do that by right-clicking down here, going to new, and by creating a solid. So this is very good to know. You could just create either a black layer or a white layer because those blend the best. So we'll create a black layer over top, and then from here I can put on 4-color gradients. I can create a grid if I want. I can create a lens flare if I want. So again, different light, different color. Place it how you want, and then you can just click toggle switches and modes and go to the blending mode and blend that layer over top of the bottom layer. So if I set it to add, these are affecting the lighter channels, so it's going to look like a light. These are the darker channels. So if I go to add, Now I have a layer that's just my lens flare, and that all started with just a black solid. So those are very useful. Again, same with 4-color gradient. You place it in there, you can change the colors, and then you just change the blending mode. Keying, this is for removing any specific thing, whether it's a color. This is used for things like green screen, noise and grain. If you want to add in grain, this is good for adding a little bit of life to different assets. And yeah, those are the basics. Again, there's hundreds of other ones that we could go through, but we're going to try and teach you the essential basics here in this tutorial. So now that we've given you this foundation of how to use After Effects, let's now take everything that we talked about and actually create a little beginner project. And to do that, I'm going to use a 3-step method, which I use for everything. So that 3-step method is number 1, prep, and that is visually identifying the spot that you want to create an effect for or alter. And that's one of the biggest parts of being an editor or working within After Effects. It's just using your eyes and finding a spot that would work well with a certain thing that you know how to do. So I'm going to scroll through my footage here, find a cool spot, maybe like right here. After all this money falls down, we'll sort of freeze this and create some effect. Step 2 is actually creating that effect or animating. So let's go in and use some of what we just learned. I'm going to create an effect where this guy is duplicated and it sort of swivels behind like I was showing you earlier. So we need to find the spot. We'll click Control-Shift-D just to split right here. So this is the spot where something's going to happen. Let's take this layer and we're going to click Control-D to duplicate it because we want him behind himself swiveling around. For that, we need a duplication. If you want to keep this easier, you can rename these layers. So I'll name this clone. And now what we need to do is we need to mask, because if I was just to go in here and transform, the entire scene is going to move because we don't have him isolated. So that's what we use our masking for, to isolate the subject. So let's actually do that before we create the clone layer. We'll delete that, go to subject, and we're going to mask it. Just create an easy little mask. So we'll connect it. We're going to select that, and now we can click Control-D to duplicate it. And now we should have this guy isolated from the background. So now this is going to be our clone layer. This is our subject. We're going to apply effects to the clone layer, what's behind our subject. So let's go to our effects and presets, and let's figure out what we want to do. I'm going to apply an offset effect. And this is just like transforming, except it's going to continuously loop back around. So you see here, if I move to the right, it's just going to keep coming in from the left like this. And that's different from just position, because if I go to position, click P, and I move this to the right, if you move this to the right, it's always going to stay to the right. So offset allows us to get that sort of loop. We'll reset this so it's starting from normal, and we're going to keyframe it so that it's animated in a specific way. And again, whenever you're keyframing an effect, you want to actually show the effect down here. So we'll open up effects, we'll open up offset, and then here we can see where we can keyframe. So we'll keyframe it at the beginning where we want it to start. We'll drag like 1 second. And you see here we're running into an issue because we have a mask, but we're working with footage. So that's where the Rotobrush would come in handy. But again, we'll show you that later. And to keep it simple, we're just going to right click, go to time, and just freeze frame both of these so that we're working with a still layer. So let's go back here. Again, drag 1 second. We're just going to shift the center a bunch. We'll just keep dragging and we'll set it like that. So we've created a keyframe animation where the background is just going to keep swiveling behind the subject. So that's just from using our effect plus our keyframe. Again, you can do anything you want here. If you want to, you can add color. You can make the back black and white. You can make the back super colorful with colorama. You can make the back distorted. It's really up to you what you want to do. So here's what we have so far. We made a cut. We isolated the subject and duplicated the subject and then applied effects to it, animated those effects with some simple keyframes. And that's what the process is going to look like for a lot of things you're doing here. You need to isolate the subject. It's very difficult to work with just 2D still footage. It's just a square, everything's in one. When you isolate the subject with your masking, now it gives you some room to work with, change specific things in the footage, and that's what creates a lot of these looks. If you want the footage back in the background, you can just take the subject layer, Control-D to duplicate it again, and just drag it all the way beneath. Again, think of it like a sandwich. We need the background behind our clones. And if you're not seeing that, it's because there's a mask on here. Click M, delete the mask. There we go. You can also stack on multiple effects. So maybe you want to add a blur. So we can add a directional blur. We can set that to the direction these are moving, which is 90 degrees. Crank up the blur length to blur that out. Add some more realistic motion. And you can even keyframe the blur length so that it'll start slow and then it'll get more blurry as it goes along. So start at 0, go to the end, put it back to 0. So you can get the idea here of how we're controlling this layer. It really doesn't matter what effects you're using. You're still learning how to control these layers the way that you want, how to animate things, change things. And then part 3 of this process is timing, making it all fit together. And this is just playing with the layer structure. So keep it all easy. You can just close these down because it's getting a little over encumbered right here. Say you wanted this to happen for like 2 seconds right there. You want it to go back to normal. Select it all, hold down Shift, select this all, Control Shift D, delete them. Now we can just drag out the normal footage, Control Shift D, and just let it start back from where it ended. There you go, controlling the timing. Stops, does the effect, goes back to normal. So what we have here, we have our background layer, we have our clone layer, which is in between, and we have our subject layer. So we're able to take what's in the foreground, we're able to take what's in between the foreground and the background, and we're able to take the background. So that's what I mean by isolating the subject. Now that we have all 3 of those layers controlled and in their own specific slots, we can add different effects and looks to the foreground if we want. We can add different effects to the midground and to the background. So if I wanted to, I can go to Tint. I can make the background its own thing like this. If I wanted to, I could go to Tint, put it on the subject. Now the subject's different. And now you're seeing how we have full control and how we're able to change things just using what After Effects has in stock. So that is the 3-step formula. If you watched everything, you can now go into any of my other tutorials. Those are going to be the same sort of setup. Controlling the layers, changing the layers, controlling the timing so that it all works together. And again, now that we have that set up, everything is in their own layer. You can add in any assets, so you don't have to be reliant on effects. You can get any assets from the internet. I have these, this is from my animation pack that's on my website. I can drag in graffiti animations, glitch animations, anything that I really want, and I can control them from that layer structure. So if I bring in a graffiti clip, it's all dependent on the layer structure, just like a sandwich. If I put it at the top of the sandwich, it's going to be over top of everything. If I want it to blend with this, again, blending mode. So now it's over everything. If I drag it 1 layer down, it's going to be only behind the subject. Another layer down, it's going to only be in front of the background. So knowing that is extremely important. So knowing how to get to this point is really all it is. The rest is just your own creativity, your own experimentation. You can do so much just with that knowledge there. All right, so the last thing I'm going to show you for this little beginner project is how to use the Rotobrush tool. That'll allow you to make it so that instead of everything freezing, you'll see this guy isn't moving at all. The Rotobrush tool is just your masking, but for footage. So instead of him being frozen, he'll be moving just like how he is in the normal shot. So I'm going to go back to project and I'm going to create a new composition. And I'm going to name this Rotobrush. I'm going to drag in the exact same footage that we were just using. So this one right here, I'll Control C to copy it, and then I'll click Control V just to paste that in. This footage does not match this composition, so we can right click, transform, fit to comp. So we're all ready to go. We're back at square one. This time we're going to use the Rotobrush tool. So it's very simple. All you need to do is double click on your footage. And once you do that, you're going to see it change from the composition to the layer. And we need to be in the layer to actually use the Rotobrush. Once you're in the layer, we can go up and grab the Rotobrush tool. So once you've done that, so now we can just click and sort of scribble, and you're going to see we get a few errors. So it's saying frame rate mismatch, set the composition to 25 FPS. So anytime you're using the Rotobrush, you need to make sure that the composition you're in is matching all of the settings of the footage that you're using. So if I go to comp settings, it says this is 30 frames per second. If I go to project and we look at the footage, you're seeing it's 25 frames per second. So it wants it to be at 25 frames per second. So just set it to whatever it wants. Go to composition settings, put it to 25, or again, whatever it's asking for. So now that'll go away and we can draw. So if you hold down Alt, it's going to change to a red brush, and that'll allow you to cut away. And the goal here is just to get this purple line around whatever it is that you want to mask out. So hold down Alt and use the red brush. If you need to, just click and use the green brush. And there you go, pretty simple. Now, because we're working with footage here, you can't just do this on one to frame. You need to click page up and page down keys to move frame by frame. So I'm going to move frame by frame and just go to the right. And I'm just checking to make sure that this purple line is staying where I want it to be. If I see this purple line messing up, I can go in and again, use that green brush, use that red brush to fix it. Luckily, After Effects has gotten a lot better with this. You rarely have to make that many adjustments like you had to in the past. So usually I'll only have to do like 1 or 2 adjustments and it's just ready to go. It's really good. Everything just sticks. It just works. So this little area here, this is the area that we're going to be masking out, this green area. So we need to set this duration for however long we want it to be. So I want it to mask up until here. So I'll set the end of the duration right there. And then we'll also grab the left and we'll set that to where we started, where we painted our first brush. So this is the section that we're going to Rotobrush out. And again, this is just masking, but essentially just automated masking. So once you're ready, go ahead and click freeze. And After Effects is going to do all of that masking for you. And it's going to mask out our moving footage. So once that's finished, to actually see it, you go over to composition. And there you go. That's what we made. So before we had to mask and it was just a still image. Now we have this masked out full footage, which is really nice. If you ever need to fix any of this, just pop back into the layer, uncheck this freeze button and you can make any changes. You can also go to effect controls and you have some options for the Rotobrush like feathering, just like you would any mask. It's really nice. And again, I use this to isolate the layers for moving footage. It's the exact same thing, only difference from that process I just showed you. Instead of using just the normal masking pen tool, we're using the Rotobrush tool. And from here, you can do the same thing. Click Control D to duplicate. Now we have this moving clone underneath, still with footage. You can click Control D to duplicate again. And you can delete the Rotobrush just like we did with the mask to bring back our background. And you can stack effects. You can do everything that we just did, all just using the Rotobrush. So super useful to know. So many of my tutorials are using that same workflow. It doesn't matter if you're creating sort of gimmicky effects or music video effects or not. You don't need to add crazy effects or oversaturate. You just need to understand how to control the layers, how to use what's in After Effects to accomplish what you want. Once you have that understanding, you can use After Effects to change your footage however you need to change it and have full control over the layers. All right, guys, so now we're going to move into one of my favorite tools in After Effects, the 3D camera. So I'm going to drag in some new footage here and we can drag this into a new composition. So let's give this a play. So a nice shot, there's some slow motion movement, there's not too much craziness going on. What I love about the 3D camera is it allows you to control the movement as if you are controlling the camera. So to add the 3D camera, you want to right click down in this gray space, you want to go to new and you want to add in a camera. So we can just leave everything by default and click OK. Now for this to actually work, you need to make sure that your layer is a 3D layer. To do that, you go down to toggle switches and modes, and you're going to find the 3D layer switch right here, this cube. Go ahead and just enable that. So now that you've done that, what you can do is control everything with the camera. So if we click C on our keyboard, that is the shortcut to control the camera. So the first one is rotation, the second one is pan, and the third is zoom. Now you may be asking, what's the difference between using the camera and using transform keyframes like I was showing you earlier? There isn't much of a difference. You're still working with a 2D layer, and I can actually show you this a little bit better. If I switch over to, if I click from active camera, we can go right. So if I move this layer, you can't see it again because it's a 2D layer. If I rotate it a little bit, now you can see what I'm talking about here. It's still a 2D layer in 3D space. You can't change that this is a 2D layer. But in my opinion, I think that the 3D camera is a lot easier in terms of just quick navigation and controlling the movement as a whole. So for example, if I set some keyframes for our 3D camera, I can move. Maybe I want to like zoom in here. You can click C and just pan like this. And then I can move a bit. set more keyframes, and then maybe I want to pop back out. I can click reset. And just like that, it gives you some intuitive controls for the camera. You can also even click C and just move frame by frame and just pan this over left and right. And again, I'm creating keyframes every time I'm doing this. I'm just moving one frame, moving a little bit, moving one frame, moving a little bit. What you're going to see now is we get this shake effect. So it gives you some really easy control of the camera. So if you have some really stale footage that you just want to add some more life into, you want to add some more movement into, the 3D camera is really easy to use. I've always used it a lot. So just from adding the 3D camera, just from adding in a couple of keyframes, we now have a completely different shot that has a lot more going on. And again, you can change the timing of this just by controlling the keyframes. Now, another great tip for the 3D camera is again using that motion blur switch that we talked about earlier. So anytime you have a zoom, anytime you have a shake, if you want this to look a lot better, it's going to look more realistic if you have some blur. So just come over here, enable the motion blur switch for the layer, just like we did earlier. And now you're going to see with that shake, you just get a lot more realism. It's a lot less stiff. And yeah, it looks pretty nice. So 3D camera, I highly recommend you guys get into a habit of using that. It's just very easy to click C and just move things around with your mouse, with your keyboard, instead of having to change specific values and just hope it ends up looking the way you want. If you play around with the timing of things, you can make some other cool effects like this Tarantino zoom, I called it in a tutorial I made, where you place the keyframes super close. You're going to have a really fast zoom, and you end up getting this super high motion blur. And again, if you go to your settings, you can even make that more dramatic like that. In my opinion, adding smooth motion, controlling the motion is one of the biggest things when it comes to making an entertaining video, matching the visual to the music. So having a tool like this is super important. Now, I showed you that example where we're essentially just rotating this 2D layer, and we're doing this all in 3D space. So once you make something a 3D layer, you see if I check this on and off, let me zoom in here. You see every time I check on the 3D layer switch, it's adding more values to your position. So this is your X axis and this is your Y axis, which you have by default in 2D. But whenever you check this on, you're getting this third value, which is your Z axis. So if you think X is across, Y is up and down, Z is moving through 3D space. So you can actually change the Z axis with that third value. So that's useful with what we're going to talk about next, which is 3D. So 3D is really fun in After Effects. I made this project before where essentially I just mask out different parts of an image. I use that Z axis, like I was just showing you, to sort of move them in different spots in 3D space. And then you create a camera and just sort of fly past all of them. Anytime you're trying to do a zoom through, so let's delete this camera for now. We'll reset everything. Say we want to do a zoom through, like for example, maybe you want to zoom through the bike right here. So I'll create a little circular mask around the wheel. And then I'm just going to click M. You can right click on a mask and track mask. So if you don't want to rotoscope, you can just do this. This is a quick and easy way just to sort of lock on to an easy shape. Just click play, let it run for a bit. And there we go. We just have some auto keyframes just like that. So we can change this to subtract. I'll click Control D to duplicate that layer. And now if we enable this as a 3D layer and we add in a camera like we had earlier, you can actually zoom through this specific part like this. So we can create a little keyframe our camera, move 1 second, and we're actually zooming through this 2D layer. So you have to think of it like this is a piece of paper. We're taking a camera and moving it through the hole in the paper. And it looks something like that. You can also use this in a transition sense. So if I click Control D, drag this below, and I'll just sort of move this over. Now you can see this within that subtracted mask. And again, if I click P, and this is a 3D layer, we can take the Z axis, and now I can move this in 3D space so that it's sort of lining up a little bit better, and it's just offsetted. Let me just create another little camera here just as an example to show you what's going on. Here you go. So here's a good visual representation of what's happening. We're going from one 2D layer and we're moving a camera in 3D space through that hole onto this second 3D layer. So if I'm taking that Z position, I'm moving this back in Z space. It may be a little hard for you guys to grasp. All you really have to know is that it allows you to move through another axis and it gives you some more options. So for example, I can still scale this up and still leave it in that Z space so it's offset. So being able to control layers in that fashion is very useful. Another awesome thing, let's go ahead and clear off all the masking. Another great thing you can do with 3D is 3D tracking. So there's a couple ways to track in After Effects. Again, I'm not going to go super in depth. The way that I like to do it the best is by right-clicking on my footage, going to track and stabilize, and going over to track camera. So After Effects is going to analyze this scene, and it's going to place specific track markers on all of these edges in the scene. To get the best results for this, you need to make sure that you have smooth motion. You don't want too much motion blur. If everything is moving around like crazy, if everything's blurry, it's going to have a hard time tracking. All right, so once our 3D track has gone through, you're going to see this bullseye and all of the tracking data. If you're not seeing that, you need to make sure you're actually clicking on the effect in the effect controls, and those will pop up. And this is really great because this allows us to track certain 2D layers to specific parts. And you can do that with this bullseye. So say, for example, we want to track some text or some graphic onto the wheel. We can right click here and we can click Create Solid and Camera. So make sure that this isn't a 3D layer like we set up from before, because we have this new 3D camera tracker. We want this to say 2D, but we want our track solid to be 3D. You can see what the track is looking like just based off the track solid. You see it's following the wheel pretty nice. And then what you can do is you can drag in any graphic you want, or in this case, I'll just drag in some text. I'll say tutorial. We can make the tutorial layer a 3D layer. So it's going to follow that new 3D camera that we just made like this. So it's tracking, but it's not in the spot that we want, which is the track solid. If you want this to be exactly where the track solid is, you have two options. Option number one, you can pre-compose the track solid. It's already in place. So you just right click and pre-compose it like we showed you earlier. And then what you can do is you can put any graphics into that pre-comp. So if I Control X to cut the text, we'll pop into the pre-comp of the track solid. You'll see here's just the solid layer. We can just hide or delete that, paste in anything we want. Tutorial. Now when we go back to the composition, it's going to be exactly where that pre-comped track solid was. So that's way number one. Way number two, you can keep the track solid here. You don't need to pre-compose it. You can sort of keep this here as a little tracking placeholder. So again, let's bring in our graphic or our font or whatever we want to track. Again, I'll make this a 3D layer. And this is where we can use our pick whip tool. So we're going to open up transform for tutorial. And you're going to see next to all of these properties is this little squiggly line. This is the pick whip. And essentially this lets you link this property to another property easily. See, if you just click and drag, it's going to light up different properties. So what we can do is we can open up the track solids position right here. We can open up our tutorial position and we can link these specific values. Now, if you don't want to do a specific value, you can just grab the normal parent pick whip right here. This is for every single value. So we can just drag this straight to track solid. So now it's completely tracked to that. And if you want it to be exactly where that is, you can just click reset. There's also different things with anchor point. So if you need to, you can adjust the anchor point to try and get this exactly where you need. So it's up to you, but now this is in the same relative 3D space as our track solid just by using that parent track. So the pick whip, very useful for being able to link two different things together. We're going to dive into the pick whip in a little bit once we talk about track mats and we talk about expressions near the end. I do want to mention another way to track instead of using the 3D camera tracker. So we'll go ahead and delete that. Can delete the effect from there. If you want to track a specific thing in your scene, not the entire 3D camera, you could just go over to this tracker window. If you're not seeing that, just go to window, make sure that tracker is checked on, and we can select the layer and just click track motion. So this is going to give you a track point. And this is great for tracking your specifics. So I can place it on the flame here. We can click analyze forward, and it's going to do basically the same thing as a track mask, but for whatever you specify in the frame. So we'll stop it. Here's all the keyframes that track just made. Now to actually apply this tracking and this movement to another layer, say for example, again, let's pop over to our composition. This time let's add in text, say tut, and then let's go back, just click back over to a layer here to see our tracking. You actually need to link this target to something specific. You can link it to the specific layer, or even better, once you have the track, you can just right click down here and go to new. And you can go to null object, and this is just a placeholder layer, and these are great for holding tracking information. So I can rename this to tracking info, and then I can click edit target. select tracking info, and then just click apply. We'll click OK. So now we have that tracking info in there, and anytime we want to link an object, an asset, text, or whatever to that tracking info, all we have to do is use that pick whip that I was showing you earlier and just pick whip it to the tracking info null. So now it's going to be following only that specific point. So that's another little useful tracking method for tracking specific things in the scene. So now let's delete both of these. We can delete our motion tracker. And let's talk a bit about track mats and expressions. And those are going to be the final two advanced tips I'll say that I leave you with this tutorial. So for track mats, these are pretty simple. Let's go ahead and create text again in this sense, but you can do this with whatever you want. So with a track mat, you're taking the channel data from one layer and tracking that into the next. That may seem very weird. You kind of have to think of it like every video is built of different channels. You have your red, green, and blue channel, which is for your color. You have your alpha channel, which represents the degree of transparency. So with that in mind, you can just click toggle switches and modes, and you're going to find this little track mat section down here. So we can track mat the alpha channel of our normal footage onto this font. So if I click track mat and go tutorial, now you're going to see all of the alpha, meaning all of the transparency only showing within the shape of the text. So this is a great little technique just for being able to copy what's inside of one layer into a specific shape. You also have these toggle options here. It's alpha matte by default, but if you click here, you can go luma matte, which is basically the lightness of this layer instead of the transparency of this layer. You can also click here to invert. So now it's going to do the opposite. It's going to take the alpha away from whatever shape you're track matting. So this is going to be transparent. Then I could create a solid or put other footage underneath everything. You guys will be able to see if I drag this all the way below, something like that. They also have their built-in little track mat pick whip, which is the same thing. Instead of using a drop down, if you want to just drag it onto whatever it is you're trying to link, you can do it that way. You're also going to notice here, whenever you track mat, it changes the layer into more of a mask. You're going to see this little icon right there. So this is going to be by default with 0 visibility. So keep that in mind. If you're not seeing your layer, you're going to have to change the visibility back on. And it's still going to hold that track mat. So there's a brief explanation of your track mats. Again, it depends on what you're trying to do, but that's the basics of how it works. Let's finally end this off by talking about expressions. So expressions are very nice. You can get super in depth with them by adding math and things like that. I'm going to keep it very simple and just talk about basic use case. Again, just adding in text. If you have any sort of shape layer or normal layer or whatever it is you want, you can make your life a lot easier. Instead of having to animate by hand, you can just use an expression to do a lot of certain things. So one of the main expressions you'll see is a wiggle expression. And this is a great expression, not only for making certain text layers or asset layers wiggle, but also for certain effects, just to add a wiggle so that there's a bit of changing and flickering with the effect. So to use the expression editor within After Effects, you need to figure out what it is you're trying to actually change around. So in this case, we want this to wiggle around. So we're going to work on the position for this text layer. To actually start the expression editor, you need to hold down Alt, and while holding down Alt, you can click on the stopwatch. So that's going to turn everything red, and you're going to see now we have this expression editor. So if you want to do a wiggle expression, you just type in wiggle, parenthesis, and you can go 2,5. This is your amplitude and your frequency right there. So just like that, if I was to now click play, and let's even bump this up a little bit more just so you can see it, you're now going to see this wiggle motion. So a lot easier than having to do it by hand. You can use wiggle or any other type of expression that you guys find out there just to make your life a lot easier. You can use this with anything like an effect, for example. So let's add in a glow effect. So we'll go to effects, I'll type in glow, and we're just going to raise the radius here to make it a little bit more like soft and dreamy. We'll lower down the intensity. So you can keep it normal if you just want it static glow. Or you can go in by hand, you can animate these values to make it do whatever you want. Or if you want to make your life easier, you can use a wiggle expression. So let's go to the glow intensity. We're going to do that same thing. We're going to hold down Alt and click the stopwatch here. And we're just going to paste in our wiggle. So I already copied it. I'll just Control V like that. So now it's going to flicker, and this is a bit too intense. So let's lower everything down. You see how we can just get pre-built animation here that's looping, that's built in just from from our expression. You can also use math to tone things down. So if you like the animation, but it's just too much glow, you can go after the wiggle here and we can type divided by 3, maybe even a bit more, divided by 5. There you go. Now we have that animation from our wiggle and we have control over what it looks like. And you can do the opposite here. You can do multiplied by 10 if you want it crazy, but that allows you just to add a bit of variance and quick animation using an expression as opposed to having to do everything by hand. And then for the final cherry on top for expressions and pick whips and all this extra things that we've been talking about here. If you want to make things a lot easier and controllable, and this is great for in-depth project files where you're working with expressions, you may need to change things on the fly or share project files or whatever. They have a lot of expression-oriented tools built into After Effects. There's actually an entire expression control tab right here, which is nice. Checkboxes, sliders. So let's add a slider, for example. We'll actually add in 2. And what's great about expressions and the pick whip tool is you can map these different values to slider effects. So if you don't want to work with numbers and change this value every time, what you can do is just highlight the first number here. This is the frequency. You can, with that highlighted, you can take your pick whip tool and we can drag this onto a slider. And we can do the same thing with the second one. This is our amplitude, highlight it, take the pick whip tool and place it onto the second slider. So now instead of having to do everything with numbers, you have everything pre-built into this slider that you can just change. The user can change it. See, if I bump up my frequency, it's going to be super crazy. If I bump up my amplitude, it's going to be very light. All right, guys. And now finally, once you're all finished, here's how we can render out our video. It's very simple. You just go up to File, Export, and you want to click Add to Render Queue. Now, once you're in the render queue here, you're going to have your output module, which is essentially just your settings. You can click here. Preset is lossless. This is going to be pretty large file size. If you want, you can go QuickTime, which is your .mov, or you can go MP4, which is this H.264. Optionally, you also can click this little arrow here and you're going to have a few presets, H.264, match render settings. So this is essentially just a higher quality MP4. So once you've set your settings, you also want to go to your output location, pretty self-explanatory. Choose where you want to export your video. Because this is a render queue, you can also add multiple renderings to this and just render them all out in one. So if you have multiple compositions, you can add them all to the render queue and then batch export them at the very end. Now, what I find myself doing is I don't actually use the render queue to export from After Effects. What I like to do is work between Adobe Premiere and Adobe After Effects. And there's a very simple way to do that. So if we create a new sequence in Adobe Premiere, you can come up here to your project bin in Premiere and click this little new item icon. From here, you want to go ahead and click transparent video. This is essentially just a placeholder layer. You can drag this into your sequence and just drag it out to give it some time. And then you just want to right click on this transparent video and you want to go up to replace with After Effects composition. And obviously to see this, you need both Premiere and After Effects installed on your computer. So once we click that, you give it a few seconds, this turns colors, you'll see After Effects is prompted down here. Now you have this After Effects linked composition and anything you place within this linked composition will show up in Adobe Premiere. So I can drag in the composition that I'd like to bring in. So here it is. And now when I click File, Save, and go back into Premiere, here's everything that I was just doing in After Effects all in Adobe Premiere. So you can edit it to your liking, you can mix it with your other edits, you can export it straight from Adobe Premiere. So yeah, that should give you a good understanding of a lot of the essential tools within After Effects. I really wanted to emphasize the layer control, using the different tools to achieve that layer control. Everything else is really up to you. There's no point in teaching this effect, that effect, because it's all up to experimentation. It's all up to your creativity, what you want to do with After Effects. A lot of my tutorials are these recreations of certain things. And I do that because I think it's better to learn by looking at a specific reference that you understand. At the end of the day, it's all about learning these little in and outs of the software so that you can create whatever it is you want to make or solve whatever problem you want to solve just from your knowledge of the software. So I hope this video has helped you. I've made over 500 tutorials with After Effects and Premiere, and I've never made a full step-by-step beginner's course. So I think this is great to reference for future material, just to onboard people, or even for people who know After Effects, but maybe could learn something new just from this. As always, guys, I'll see you in the next one. Talk to you later.